Welcome to the EmpoweredPatientPodcast.com show. I'm Karen Jagoda, and my guest today is David Beers. He's the co-founder, CEO, and president of Halia Therapeutics, HaliaTherapeutics.com, and the topic today is inflammation drug discovery. So, Dave, I want to welcome you to the show today. I really appreciate you taking some time to be with us.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here. I'm excited to chat with you today.
Thank you. I understand that the therapies that you're working on target the immune system's response to resolve chronic inflammation. And the idea here is that there are a lot of diseases that are affected by inflammation. So I thought we should start with you just describing for us what some of those diseases are that you're really focused on.
Yeah, no, that's great. So, yeah, it's been really an interesting process. In my career, I'm a trained cell biologist, PhD in cell biology, and back when I was a graduate student, we actually didn't know that much about our immune system, and we've learned over the years that our immune system actually, when we're young, it's helping keep us alive and protecting us from infection and injury, and as we get older, it actually plays a role in our aging. And in fact, I tell people as we get older, it's trying to kill us, our own immune system. So as we've learned a lot about chronic diseases, and these are things that, are familiar to all of us, things like Alzheimer's disease and heart disease and cancer even. There's a very large inflammatory component to all those diseases. And we've really just in the past few years appreciated more and more what role the immune system plays in those diseases and how we could potentially therapeutically be able to target those.
Tell us a little bit about the current approaches that exist to these conditions that particularly are addressing the inflammation.
Yeah. So, I think all of us, I think I think it's intuitive to understand that trying to treat a disease when it's very advanced is very difficult, and trying to treat it earlier is something that could be a much better prognosis for patients. That the earlier we could catch a disease and treat it, the better off we are. And what we've discovered is that the inflammation usually plays an important role early on in diseases. So things like Alzheimer's disease and that's really where our company started. Actually, we actually started with, in fact, the name Halia is a Hawaiian name. One of our co-founders, or a scientist that we work with, his name is Keone Kawe. So Keone and I have been friends for many years, and we started the company to try to better understand what was driving the onset and progression of Alzheimer's disease. And Halia, the name means fond memories, and so we were actually focused on really trying to understand why some patients, as we've discovered, and specifically for Alzheimer's, that we get deposits of these aggregate proteins called beta amyloid, or A beta protein that accumulates in the brains of these patients. And, what we've discovered is that a lot of people, as they get older, will have these deposits, but really the difference between people that have active Alzheimer's disease and people that don't is the inflammatory response. And so trying to understand the role of inflammation in a disease like Alzheimer's has really been a big focus of not just our company, but many companies, to try to understand what triggers that, how it actually affects the onset and progression of the disease, and whether it plays a role just early or whether it plays it late. And so we've I think when I say we as a field, we've been focused on trying to see how we can intervene and turn off these pathways that are associated with inflammation. And one thing I should mention is, inflammation's a normal, healthy process. It's something that we all have familiarity with. If we've all cut ourselves, we've all twisted our ankles at some point in time, and we experience the acute inflammatory response. And that's a normal, healthy process that our body has to help respond to damage or infection, and to be able to promote the healing process. And we call that acute inflammation. And that's the healthy part. Chronic inflammation is actually, we used to think that it was actually just an unresolved acute inflammatory response. You had some sort of injury or insult or defect that the body responded to. And then it never resolved. It failed to resolve that acute inflammatory response. And we used to think that, and that's what I was taught when I was being trained, was that chronic inflammation was just a failed resolution of acute inflammation. What we discovered now is that there's actually a different pathway that leads to the activation of this inflammatory response in chronic inflammatory diseases. And so we've been trying to figure out, well, how do we actually target that? And especially, how do we target it and leave the normal healthy process alone? And that's been the real challenge. And I think everyone, once again, is familiar with this just in their own life. And we've all taken, Advil and ibuprofen and acetaminophen, Tylenol and aspirin. And those are all anti-inflammatories that we're familiar with. And those are still used as really the foundation of treating a lot of inflammatory diseases. But we're trying to be more precise and specific of the way we try to target chronic inflammation. And, it's been just in the past few years that we've developed drugs. So you've probably seen commercials for drugs like Humira. Humira is a very popular drug that tries to target chronic inflammatory signaling by blocking a signaling molecule called TNF alpha that's released by immune cells that propagates a lot of the effects of chronic inflammation. And so we've gotten better and better at trying to narrow down on how we can block these inflammatory responses. But there's actually just been in the past few years a real explosion in our knowledge of really what the root drivers of chronic inflammation are. And that's, at Halia, that's what we're focused on, is trying to take out the root cause, not some of the downstream effects or the signaling molecules, but actually take out the thing that is responsible, the machine inside the cell that's actually activated, that's propagating these signals. And if we can turn that off, we think we can really get to the root cause of what's driving these problems in all these different diseases.
And is that target the NLRP3 inflammasome?
Yes, yeah. So it's got a funky scientific name, and it's just in the past few years we've discovered that there's these cellular machines that get formed under the right conditions that help propagate or signal this inflammatory response. And we call those machines inflammasomes. And there's actually 5 that we know of. There's probably a few more that are kind of what we call non-canonical inflammasomes. But the inflammasomes has kind of been a really hot area of research in lots of different diseases, is to try to understand how these protein complexes get formed inside cells and how they stay stuck on in chronic inflammation. And the one that we've been very interested in is called the NLRP3 inflammasome. And that one specifically, I think there's a lot of interest in that as a potential drug target, because its association with being turned on, it's associated with many, many different diseases. In fact, we did a search of the scientific literature just recently, and there's been thousands of publications in the last 5 years connecting the NLRP3 inflammasome with everything from Alzheimer's disease to heart disease to, COPD to psoriasis to inflammatory bowel disease. So the list goes on and on. Almost everything you can think of that's a chronic disease has an inflammatory component and has been connected to NLRP3. So it's one of these biological discoveries that seems to be the key to a lot of the things that are the diseases that we've been very interested in trying to come up with new ways to target.
Tell us about your lead program and the specific types of diseases that you're doing the trials on.
Sure, yeah. So we developed a new way to try to target the NLRP3 inflammasome. So the inflammasome is a big protein complex. It can be hundreds of, not thousands of proteins that come together. And the function of the inflammasome is to activate an enzyme inside the cell, and that enzyme is called caspase-1. And what that enzyme does is it goes and cleaves. It's what's called a protease, and it'll digest other proteins and cleave them in a specific spot. And it can either inactivate protein function, or it can activate proteins. And so we've been trying to figure out, how does the inflammasome activate this protease, and what are the targets of the protease, and what happens when all that pathway gets activated. And so at Halia, we started, as I mentioned, in trying to understand how this pathway gets activated in Alzheimer's disease. So we had studied a family here. We're headquartered in Salt Lake City, Utah. And one thing about Utah that maybe everybody doesn't know, but we do a lot of human genetics in Utah. And the reason why is we have large families in Utah, but we also have a unique resource, which is called the Utah Population Database. And what that is the government, the state government, made an agreement with the Mormon Church, or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And the Mormon Church has a big genealogical database, and the state merged their health records with that genealogical database. And what that allows us to do is to do searches for families that have different conditions. So we can ask the question here in Utah, can you show me a family that has Alzheimer's in every generation over, 4 or 5 generations? You can't do that in California. You can't do it. In fact, you can't do it in any other state. It's a unique resource. So we were doing some human genetics work looking for families that had a predisposition to Alzheimer's, or high risk for developing Alzheimer's. Now, there's some genetic factors that put people at risk for developing Alzheimer's, and one that's very well known is a DNA polymorphism, or you could call it a mutation, but it's a DNA sequence that's different in this population. And we found a family that had that polymorphism, but interestingly, none of them got Alzheimer's. We had a lot of family data, and nobody in that family got Alzheimer's. So we said, well, what's different about these guys? Have a high genetic risk factor, and none of them are getting Alzheimer's. What is different about those people? So we actually did some work with the family, and obviously with their consent and participation, we actually discovered that family had a second mutation or polymorphism that actually protected them from Alzheimer's. And so the whole focus of our company was to try to figure out, well, what is that mutation? What does it do? And how does it protect people from developing Alzheimer's? And over a lot of research, what we discovered was that mutation played a role in a specific pathway in the cell of how proteins get moved around and put in the right place inside the cell. And it turns out the inflammasome is very, very sensitive to that pathway. And so these mutations actually decrease the ability of cells. And so every cell in their body has this mutation. So they have a decreased capacity to actually respond to inflammation, or to develop chronic inflammation. And so that's what got us excited and interested in this pathway. And so we developed a drug that our goal was to try to mimic what the mutation the protection that the mutation provided in this family, and to mimic that in every cell that we treat. And so that was really the goal of the program. And so we developed a compound that we call HT6184, and we've moved that into early human clinical trial testing. And so we've just completed kind of the first stage of testing, where we normally, when we do drug development, in kind of large non-life-threatening conditions, we usually move into using healthy volunteer subjects. So these are usually young, healthy college kids that sign up to be participants in a early clinical study. And so we've completed that first portion of that study, where we look at how our drug gets absorbed, how it gets eliminated. And in this case, we actually have developed some assays that we can run in the blood to look at what happens to this inflammatory pathway, or the inflammasome. And so we've completed the first portion, and we're just completing kind of the second portion of that testing, where we give people multiple doses. And so far it looks very, very promising. The drug has a very long half-life. It stays around for a long time. And in fact, it stays around for more than 50 hours, its half-life. So it takes more than 50 hours for it to go away, half of the concentration to go away in the blood. And so we get very, very nice, long, prolonged exposure, and we see very nice effects on blocking inflammation. And so the goal for this is as soon as we wrap up this next stage, is really to move into real patients that have chronic inflammatory conditions. And as a smaller company, we typically like to try to find more rare diseases to start with. Doing clinical trials is very challenging, and especially if you're a small company competing with larger companies for the same patient population, it becomes really difficult. And so we tend to try to find smaller populations where we can have a little bit more competitive advantage to try to isolate a population that really is responsive to, or potentially responsive to, the pathway that we're trying to target. So we've found a couple different populations of people that have chronic inflammatory conditions that we're trying to launch studies, and we should have a couple phase 2 clinical trials ready to go later this year. And so we'll be announcing our plans for launching those studies here in just the next few months.
Tell us about your team members and the different expertise that you have in developing these kinds of novel therapies.
Yeah, no. So we've got a really great team. So this is something that to me it's the exciting part about what we do is this is really a team effort, and we work together. Everyone kind of having different expertise. So as I mentioned, my background is really in cell biology, but I trained with a pretty famous clinical researcher, a guy named Dan von Hoff, and Dr. von Hoff has run more than 500 phase 1 clinical trials. So he has a lot of experience as being the first physician to give a drug to a patient for the very first time. And so I trained with him for a few years and learned a lot, saw probably more than 100 drugs enter clinical trials. And so I've kind of had a nice broad-based exposure to early bench, basic science all the way to clinical research. And so I've had this drug that we just started human testing. This is the 16th drug that I've discovered that I've actually moved into human studies. And then to support our team, we have, or to support the development of this program, we have a chief medical officer, so somebody who is a physician that has had experience with doing a lot of clinical trials. We're real excited. We just got Maggie Amesbury. She's our chief medical officer. She just joined us from Amgen, so a large biotech company, and we recruited her over to join our team. We'd actually worked with Maggie in the past at a different company. And that's kind of been a theme for us as we've stayed together, this core team, for a long time. We have a group of chemists that help us with the manufacturing of the drug, the chemist that actually was responsible for the initial synthesis and discovery of the drug. We do a lot of the discovery work computationally now. So we actually use computer programs to help us design the structure of compounds. And it's been really exciting in my career to move from really kind of just very brute force trial and error to a more directed approach where we design these drugs on a computer. And that's been exciting and just really revolutionary to watch. So we do a lot of that. And so we have a team of people that is, very experienced and very smart at doing these computational design. And then we have clinical operations people that help with the conduct of the trial. We have a laboratory biology team that does a lot of the preclinical testing to show the drug does what we think it does and to validate that. But it's a lot of fun. We have nurses. We have a nurse on our team. We have several PhD scientists. We have a physician, and then obviously we need some business people to help us with raising money and making sure that we have the proper controls on spending money. This is an expensive thing. It's frustrating how expensive it is to discover and develop drugs, but it's the reality of what we have to do.
Thanks to my guest today, Dave Beers, co-founder, CEO, and president of Halia Therapeutics, haliatherapeutics.com. Follow them on Twitter at Halia_TX. I'm Karen Jagoda, and you've been listening to the EmpoweredPatientPodcast.com show. Follow me on Twitter at Karen Jagoda. Like us on Facebook at Empowered Patient Radio. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.